My name is Bianca Casella, and I'm a student at Columbia Sustainability Management Program. Our next panel, Why Brazil? The Challenges and Opportunities on the Net Zero Race, will deep dive on some of the aspects Arminio raised and bring up others. Since the current global context described in the former panel, why do we believe Brazil is well-positioned to profit from the current race to net zero? Why are other countries still unaware of our potential to provide climate solutions? What new policy instruments and actions shall we pursue to enhance our positioning? Are there different perspectives among different sectors and stakeholders? Now, I call to stage 4 experts to tell us more about Brazil's challenges and opportunities in this fast-moving agenda. Please welcome Tony Lent, co-founder of Capital for Climate, Natalie Unterstell, president of Instituto Talanoa, Marina Grossi, president of CEBDS, Luciana Costa, director of Infrastructure, Energy Transition, and Climate Change at BNDES. This panel will be mediated by Jorge Hargrave, director at Maraé Investimentos and member of the board of the Brazil Climate Summit.
Good morning, everyone. I must start this panel as a member of with my hat of a member of the organizing team. I'm very happy to see all of you today with us. And I'm very happy to see friends and familiar faces that have been following this topic for a long time. But I have to say that I'm even happier to see all of those that I don't know. New people that have never talked about climate change in Brazil, or that have never thought about the role that Brazil can play on it. So I'm really happy to see you. Look around you. As you see, at least a third of the audience or half of the audience consists of non-Brazilians. So this was our goal, to make this a real dialogue between Brazil, Brazilians, and the global community. These people who came here are really interested to understand what role Brazil can play, what role Brazilian companies, what role Brazilian citizens can play in this global collaboration, as Luciana well said. This panel, Why Brazil?, is exactly about that. We want to understand from different perspectives what role Brazil can play, what role companies can play, and what the world expects and can get from Brazil to this challenge. So let me put back my moderator hat here, and I'll start with the questions. So we'll do a first round where I would like our panelists to do kind of a sales pitch of Brazil. So if you had to sell Brazil for climate investors, for the climate global community, how would you sell that? Tony, you as the only foreigner here around us, I'll start with you. You've been working as an investor in the low-carbon economy for the last 20 years. And now, so a few years ago, you chose Brazil, right? So now you're focused on Brazil. This means that you believe that Brazil is a powerhouse for this, as a solution for climate change. Why do you believe other investors, other global citizens should do the same bet and bet in Brazil as a global leader in the climate change agenda?
Well, thank you for having us here today, and thank you for that question. I'm going to answer it by talking about a set of external factors and a set of internal factors that make me highly confident that Brazil has the opportunity to become basically the number one destination for international capital looking for opportunities, particularly around the nature-based solution space. And I'll explain why later that's so important in the context of Brazil. So first of all, in the last 5 years, the changes that we've seen in capital markets around climate and nature are absolutely astounding. A couple of key facts, right? More than half of all professionally managed capital has signed on to net zero, right? What that means is all that capital is now focused on their portfolios and on the corporations that they own and on driving those corporations towards net zero. What's that total capital base? That's around 130 trillion. Now let's look at the part of the capital base that's focused on nature. More than 8.6 trillion of AUM is now focused on deforestation-free portfolio management. There's a whole nother community that's now focused on nature-positive investment, and there's another community that's focused within the corporate sector on deforestation-free supply chains. A lot of capital is interested in this space. Now, we think back about what Paula said in the prior panel. Around 37% of global emissions can be abated using nature-based solutions. Agroforestry, ecosystem restorations, regenerative agriculture, et cetera. What she didn't say, which I think is incredibly important in the Brazilian context and in the global context, is the total cost of implementing nature-based solutions globally is around $10 trillion. Those are the best estimates. The cost of the energy transition is more than $100 trillion. So think about that for a second. 37% of my emissions reductions for 10 trillion versus around 70% or 65% for 100 trillion. It's just much more capital efficient to drive capital towards nature-based solutions. As a result, capital wants to try to find those opportunities. So we see a convergence, and continuing convergence of the nature and climate trends within the investment community. We see that same convergence within the policy community, and we see a consensus within the techno-economic community that this solution is critical. So then, capital smart is looking around the world. It's looking at Asia, it's looking at Africa, it's looking at Latin America. So why is Brazil in such a strong competitive position now looking internally? It has three sets of assets that no other country has in the same combination. We've just heard it has the largest forestry assets, has the largest terrestrial biodiversity, has the largest opportunities for large-scale afforestation and ecosystem restoration, and it has the largest opportunity to do sustainable production of beef. Huge opportunities. Combined with that, it also has an incredibly sophisticated agribusiness community that operates at the landscape level, so largest scale operators in ag in the world that already have gone through one green revolution and who can be brought into the second green revolution. So that's talent, right? And it has a lot of that talent and also a really robust ag tech sector. And then lastly, capital markets. Brazil has a really sophisticated capital market that's really well regulated and that already is accustomed to bringing in international capital. Obviously, it can do more, but think about it. If you're an international investor and you've decided you're going to have a nature-positive agenda, you're going to compare global regions. You're going to look at the Congo Basin, which has a lot of forests. You're going to look at Southeast Asia, which has a lot of forests. You're going to look at Latin America, which has a lot of forests, and you're going to wind up looking at Brazil. And you're going to focus on it. So what we see is a wall of capital that's inevitably going to drive towards Brazil. The question is, how can we get that capital in the country as easily as possible?
Thanks a lot, Tony. Marina, you're next. So you've been leading the Brazil Business Council for Sustainable Development, CEBDS, for a while now. So this means you know everything that the climate leaders and climate pioneers in Brazil are doing, right? So super well connected. So seeing all of that, why do you see Brazilian companies are ready to be leaders in this net zero world?
Thank you, Jorge. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I think I can call for the actions that we are doing. We have 110 big companies. It's almost 50% of the Brazilian GDP. And our leaders, we have a council that we put all together, our CEOs. That's one up here that I'm just looking at him, and some others. And I think the private sector played a crucial role in this sense. You know, in the last years, we were the ones that was really pushing for carbon neutrality by 2050 in Brazil. We had signatures of 119 CEOs sign up that we need to be according to the Paris Agreement and be net zero by 2050, because Brazil, in the previous government, was signed for 2060, the neutrality of carbon. And so that was very important to be in the game. Another thing that we did is carbon market, also with the companies. So answer your question is, I think private sector is in Brazil playing a huge role. We have a net zero platform because we have a lot of changes there. We have big companies, but we have a challenge on scope 3 and others in value chain. So how to do with this? So we have a net zero platform. Also we have action for nature platform. And I think, you know, what Tony just said, in this momentum, I think we are more mature to say that those two crises, loss of biodiversity and climate change, they are interconnected. And Brazil can be a hub for solutions for this. I think a study by BCG was pointing out that 2 to 3 trillion can be, you know, investing for those kinds of solutions. So, and there are another things that I think we could mention. Brazil probably is the only country, at least a continental country, that can be reach net zero without new technology. So that's something that the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro just said. And also, we can be the first country to reach net zero. We have a problem, of course. The most important one is illegal deforestation. That's the challenge, but we are seeing some signs on the Amazon. That was the big area that we sign up and we find a lot. We didn't succeed, but now seems that we are going to really change this. That's the elephant in the room, illegal deforestation. But also deforestation, because Brazil is also a country that maybe we don't need any other cutting tree, as I think Hermínio Fraga just said, to be more productive. So that's so many areas that we can really can improve. And maybe we are also a country that we can do by our own. We just need, you know, political determination to mobilize for that, because illegal deforestation and long-distance transportation is our main challenges. I think, of course, inequality as well. So I think we can really. We're really in a good situation. In private sector, we are really, even our multinational companies, they know that in Brazil, they have a different role to play. So they take advantage for that. We can be 20% of the nature-based solutions. So it's so many things that we can position ourselves as the solutions, the climate hub. I would say the climate hub for the whole world.
Thank you, Marina. And I have to say, so I've known Marina for a while now, and I remember having these conversations at COPs and while I was in government, that Marina was leading a group of CEOs that wanted to be regulated. You know, this doesn't happen very often, that companies come to the government, please regulate us. We want a carbon market, very strict, please, we want that. And now we are close to that, thanks to Marina and others' efforts. So Natalie, we also have a long story together. I remember we first started working together in Brazil in 2008, right? So we've been to...
We're getting old.
We're getting old. Many COPs together. So you've been following this policy discussion and being part of the policy discussion in Brazil and globally for a while now. So looking at the policy side, so do you believe Brazil can also lead the policy discussion? As like Sherry said very well, that there's a policy influence among countries, a policy race among countries. Can Brazil lead already? Do we have policies that can influence and inspire the world?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's good to be here, to be back, by the way. And I'm convinced that yes, actually from a political perspective, we have to always bear in mind that transition is a battle between the green reformers and those that want to protect the status quo. So basically those that want to change, want to go beyond fossil fuels, beyond deforestation, and those that want to maintain things as they are. And I think the main advantage that we have in Brazil is precisely what you just mentioned, and Marina also. We have a broad coalition of the willing. We have the corporates, we have the indigenous peoples, we have the investors, people that since the 2000s were the ones saying we need zero deforestation, when nobody wanted to even talk about that. We have people, we have the narrative, and we started to build the policies to that end. That's why we have the Amazon Fund. It was not an idea in the government or someone who pushed the button one day and said, oh, look, great idea. No, we had to build, to craft our roadmap to leadership. And this is well reflected, I think, nowadays, Jorge, in the various races within the net zero race. So in the race to critical minerals, which is important globally, also in Brazil, we do have some endowments, but we need to create a safe space for that to be operated. Another thing is the race to sustainable food. This is absolutely critical. In our case, we are the largest exporter, right? So that's another dimension. And of course, nature and also energy. We are not that well positioned in the EV race, so electrification is still not our cup of tea. I hope we can get better in that. But in terms of what we can do, I think we are coming from a disadvantage point. We are currently the 5th largest emitter. We have responsibilities around that, for sure. But at the same time, we are perhaps, if not the only one, but one of the few countries that can really get to zero in the coming 15, perhaps 20 years. As Marina mentioned, there are studies, we have been part of a coalition called the Climate and Development, which got not only the models, but validated visions for 2030 that prove that we can get to 2030 with 80% less emissions than we had in 2005. Who else can do that? Right? It's really an important thing. And let me end by saying the following. We have the coalition, we have the courage to do so, and we have the policy frameworks. We are seeing progress in relation to deforestation in the Amazon. Just this year, if we kind of take the data from what the government has released, Brazil might have saved around 200 million tons so far, so it's half of South African annual emissions to start with, and there's much more to be done. But radically reducing deforestation is one of the things that will be absolutely important for us in this decade. The second is doing some restoration. Not much. People talk about 12, 20 million. We've been talking about these big numbers, but not necessarily implementing them for a while. But if we do 4 or 5 re-greens, I know re-green people are around. If we have 4 or 5 re-greens, I think that's already a lot. And finally, getting the carbon price right. We are on the verge of getting a legislation approved. Many of us have been working hard for that. If we do these 3 things without any other breakthrough technologies, without massive investments, we can get to 2030 with 20% of the emissions we have in 2005. So I think that's the main thing, and there are many of us working to make that a reality.
Thank you, Natalie. Luciana, I turn now to you. You lead the climate agenda at BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank, which is a huge bank. It's comparable to like global development banks in terms of size. What is your view? Do you believe Brazil is already ready to be one of the leaders? Which sectors? What would you highlight as a sales pitch?
Okay, thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Marina, Natalie, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Luciana. Thank you for the University of Columbia. Yes, we do believe Brazil can be a green giant in various fronts, because the only big economy and the only country among the G20 which has the comparative advantage that Brazil has, the only country is Brazil. We have comparative advantage on the power and energy matrix, like Luciana mentioned. The world, 30% of the greenhouse gas emission in the whole world comes from the power sector. And in order to reduce the emissions in the power sector, it's expected at least $60 trillion of investments. Brazil is already ahead of that. We are ahead in that agenda. Last year, 92% of our power matrix was renewable, and the price of solar and wind in Brazil is still decreasing. So we expect to add more power and wind energy to our matrix in the upcoming years. We also have advantage because Brazil has 75% of the car fleet already adherent to biofuels in the country. And we have more than 40 years of experience with biofuels in Brazil. We talk a lot about electrification of the global fleet, which is a reality for China, for the US. But in Brazil, we already have this advantage. And because of the biofuels industry, we have comparative advantage in producing SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. The world will need Brazil to decarbonize the aviation industry because Brazil has experience with biofuels and has land available to produce SAF in the amount which will be needed in the near future. We also, Brazil is the #1 country globally in terms of reforestation potential. Brazil can contribute to up to 1 gigatons of CO2 emission per year if we are able to increase reforestation. Of course, it's complex. It's complex to mobilize capital for that. It's capital intensive. It's project finance driven, in my opinion, but it's a type of project finance that we are still learning and we don't have, and we have to gain experience in that sense to really mobilize capital for that. We also are it's important to mention that Brazil has a sustainable agriculture already. We are #1 or 2 exporting in many food products like soybean, orange juice, and part of our agriculture is already sustainable. We have we can be giant in green industrial projects because our matrix is already clean. We can produce green fertilizer, green steel, so Brazil is well positioned for that. Brazil might have the cheapest green hydrogen, and to conclude, in terms of geopolitical, Brazil is also well positioned. We are in peace with the rest of the world, and that counts in terms to attract investments.
Thanks a lot, Luciana. So I hope they managed to convince you all to invest in Brazil after the speech. Lorea, you're going to be the judge of your master in sales pitch, so you tell them if they're good. So now, after all convinced, I'll ask them to do the opposite, right? So let's be mean to ourselves, let's be critical to Brazil, and let's think about what we're missing. Let's think about like what else. So we have good endowments, good starting point in several sectors, but what else do we need to do? We have a lot of homework, there's deforestation and so on and so forth. Let's not deny any of them. So I'd like to get your perspectives on that. Marina, I'll start with you. Brazil has been typically a technological follower, right? It's been like that over and over in the last technological breakthroughs. But in this case, we want it to be different. So what do we have to do so that in this case, Brazil becomes a real pioneer? How can we become market makers, not market followers?
Thank you, Jorge. I'm a bit more optimistic than you are. So Luciana just talked about biofuels. We change so much we are clean, we have ethanol, we have so many things, you know. We need electric cars more in the cities, we have long distance transportation that we have to build highways, infrastructure, that's a lot of things that we have to do. But I think there is opportunities that our companies already are working on. So second generation of ethanol, sustainable aviation fuels, biomethane. So there is a lot of things that companies are already doing. We just launched a study on what they are doing in the Amazon region. And there is a lot of answers from there. combining the traditional area with a very disruptive area. So I think we are already doing something. But let me take agriculture, for instance. I think Natalie told about agriculture. In Brazil, changed completely. Before we were importing products from outside, and now we are exporting, a big exporting. I think that's the right momentum to build a new agriculture, to work on this. So a regenerative agriculture, Brazil can be the one on regenerative agriculture. If we do that, we're seeing signs on the cycle of water, we're seeing, the soil, what is happening. So I think, keeping this good momentum that we have in agriculture, we have to think about regenerative agriculture, and I think we can lead this. Of course, that's also nature-based solutions. That is a lot of things that we can do. And we're talking about carbon credit, and you mentioned our work in carbon credit since 2016. And I think we need to have the right governance to really know how to deal with carbon credits. What kind of credits should we keep, and what kind of credits should we sell? I think this kind of discussion, because we're so in the battle to discuss about illegal deforestation, please make the carbon credit, and that's a lot of things that I think we have to accelerate. Green taxonomy, some regulations for instance, for offshore, for hydrogen, and that's a lot of things that we have to build. But I think maybe we have to collaborate more with the government in this green package, for instance, that the Minister Haddad, the Minister of Finance, just launched. And we're going to have measures until the end of the mandate of President Lula, I think. I think the process is more important than what will arrive from this process. So in the process, I think we don't have so much resources like US or like the Europe and with the Green Deal. Thank you. So I think the resources that we have, and I think Luciana is really paying attention for that, but the resources that we have has to be really cost effective. And for that, we have to listen private sector, we have to listen society, we have to listen what is really working, because we have to accelerate what should be done, but we have to apply our resources, our few resources, in the right way.
Thank you, Marina. Natalie, as a segue to Marina's points, from a public policy perspective, what should be our priorities so that we converge to state-of-the-art climate change policies?
I think there are three domains where we need to not only catch up with the best in class, but also to show our strength. So the first being Brazil becoming a front runner in climate policy implementation. As we were mentioning, there are so many opportunities. We know what the roadmap is. It's not that difficult. Well, it's challenging still, but currently we don't have the right signals at the highest level. For instance, Brazil's NDC is still the one from the previous government with some various problems, technically and politically speaking. So this is one example. And at the same time, when we talk about implementation, the policies or the policy benefits, they're not visible to the end users. How many of us here still have gas-powered ovens at home? How many of us, are really taking advantage of ethanol as the fuel for our cars? So just a few examples of the potential and the reality. The reality is we are not necessarily net zero or carbon neutral citizens and consumers, and that's also part of the policy. We need the right incentives and we need the right signals backing that. So this is one area. Secondly, I think it's clear that we can be a pioneer in setting standards internationally for nature and nature-based economies. We have experiences from the past that were great. For instance, I mentioned the Amazon Fund before. That was the basis for the adoption of international mechanisms on REDD+. We can cite many here. But the issue is that more than just, coalescing with other nations that are nature-rich, we have to create new standards. And I think this is not yet clear where we're going to do this, what is our goal. And then COP30, of course, is a great opportunity, right? Because it will be our stage to shine and to really but build together some ideas, some standards in that regard. And finally, I think that one of the most critical things, and that, as Marina mentioned, sometimes we are so much focused on the irrational pattern of deforestation that we avoid or we ignore the energy dimension of the transition, right? Currently, we don't have, in my point of view, a real plan to phase out fossil fuels completely and fastly. Actually, we have a lot of new departments, new areas in government, also in BNDES, which are labeled energy transition. I think that's great, but that doesn't mean we have a plan. And what we need to have a plan, we need first a starting date. When are we going to start phasing out fossil fuels in our country? And secondly, we need an end date, right? If you're talking about net zero and in 2050, are we talking about phasing out fossil fuels by then or later? Anyway, it starts with that. So what I think we really need is a fast, a full, and a fair phase out of all fossil fuels in all sectors and the replacement of that with renewables and with technology. And to end, we have so many opportunities to lead, right? We have the COP30, we have the G20 presidency coming up, and I think Brazil's role in terms of policy making and standard setting also should encompass delivering a comprehensive package for the energy transition globally. I think we have the stage, we have the trust from other countries, and nobody has done that before, not at the UNFCCC level. So why not us? Why not us really leading the energy transition this time? Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Luciana, so we've talked about several of the things that we have to do. Can you give us a little bit more details about what is BNDES' role on that? How will you support the transition in Brazil?
Okay. Yes, I agree with Natalie. Brazil is lagging behind in terms of regulation. We still don't have a carbon markets regulated. We don't have regulation for carbon markets. We don't have regulations for green hydrogen. We don't have regulation for CCUS. I mean, you name it, but we are working on that. At BNDES, currently, we are drafting and discussing with the governments and commenting on all those regulations. Like Marina said, we are planning, the government is working on, I think, on a green pack to go to the Congress, and they have to approve it. But the government is willing to approve the law of the carbon credits, the law of green hydrogen, the law of wind offshore, the law of CCUS and storage. So currently the government is working on that. And in my opinion, this is an agenda which unify the country, because, I mean, no one will say, no, we are against passing a law of green hydrogen, for instance. In terms of the energy transition and reforestation, indeed, this government is already doing a lot in terms of fighting deforestation. Deforestation is decreasing a lot in Brazil, is already decreasing from it has decreased already 42% this year. So it's a big number, and it's tough to fight illegal crime. In terms of energy transition, BNDES is working. I mean, we just approved the first project of biomethane. We do believe that the oil and gas industry is part of the energy transition. So we are working with Petrobras to have an agenda of transition, because historically the oil and gas sector is very important for technology launching, for developing new technologies. They have experience of producing, storing, and transporting energy. So we need to do a fair and just transition. We cannot leave anyone behind. We have to reduce, according to some projections, today the world consumes 100 barrels of oil or equivalent, and we will consume 57 in 2050. So we need to have we need to have a clear path of reduction of oil and gas consumption and replacement for other types of renewable energy. Brazil can be a champion in biomethane, in sustainable aviation fuel. Electromobility, we are working on electromobility with some big cities in São Paulo, and we will approve the first project this year to replace diesel buses by electric buses in São Paulo city. So Brazil is lagging behind in terms of regulation, is trying to catch up in terms of projects for energy transition, and we do have that in our pipeline. And I think we have to work together, I agree, with the private sector, and we are doing that.
Thank you, Luciana. Tony, let's get a little bit more specific into nature-based solutions. This is such an important topic for Brazil. So me and Natalie, we've been working on several ways of calling nature-based solutions for 15 years or so. And now I think we have a term, we have the willingness, we have money. Things are moving, but in your view, what are the top 3 things we need to do to really make this agenda take off in Brazil?
Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to put nature-based solutions in context of Brazilian emissions. I think it's a really important thing to understand. 74% of Brazil's greenhouse gas equivalent emissions come from forestry and agriculture, right? That's huge. As we heard before, the emissions absorption potential from nature-based solutions deployed across the landscape is somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 gigatons per year, the largest in the world for any forested nation. So what that means is that nature-based solutions are strategic to the country, and they're also strategic in terms of economic development. So what's missing in order to help release that potential? I think we've already heard about this, but I want to just emphasize it. I know that the regulation is in development, but having a coherent national carbon regulation that includes forests and agriculture, and that links the compliance market to the voluntary market, is a huge unlock for the country. And I know now that that regulation is in development. There's a lot of people around the world waiting to see how it comes out at COP. It's super important. Given that it's so important to the national economy, another thing that's critical is thinking about it differently. Thinking about nature-based solutions as an emerging economic sector and not as a set of disparate specific solutions. That hasn't happened yet. So that's one of the reasons that we formed the Nature-Based Solutions Investment Collaborative last fall with 10 leading asset managers that were all interested in collaborating on pioneering investment in the space. The way we started that was we did a series of interviews, around dozens of interviews, around 60 interviews in the fall of 2021, talking to thought leaders, think tanks, investors, entrepreneurs, and project developers. And what we did is we took a science-based approach, and we asked them, here are the 10 solutions that the scientific community says are the most important globally. Which of these 10 solutions do you think can scale to millions of hectares by 2030 and start to represent an economic alternative to deforestation driven by agriculture and the current forestry model? And what they came back with was a ranking, a rough ranking, and a set of solutions which can be seen as a system. They included, unsurprisingly, regenerative agriculture, not potentially surprisingly, agroforestry, community-based, forestry-based enterprise, restoration of degraded pastures, and large-scale afforestation and ecosystem restoration amongst 7. So how do you scale up an entire sector? You need to have a pretty strategic approach. You need to know which of those solutions are working, and you need to have business cases for the ones that are successful, and you need to understand what it takes to actually accelerate the ones that are still emerging. To put it in perspective, we only have 6.5 years to 2030. Having been in energy project development and an investor in the transition for more than 20 years, one simple fact is that 6.5 years is just, luckily, it's just 2 project cycles. So it's a very, very short period of time. So what we thought was missing was a really coherent map of all the nature-based solutions enterprises in the country, so we can identify and encourage emerging champions, and so we can understand and focus on scale-up bottlenecks. The other thing that we thought would be helpful was creating structured engagement with international investors that showcases the investable pipeline. And so on those fronts, what we did is we formed a research team together with a group at INSPIR, and thus far we've mapped out and documented more than 160 enterprises that are either ventures, product companies, project developers, that are all working to scale nature-based solutions. We're also in the process of running a series of international investor roadshows, virtual and real, in Sao Paulo in November. And we hope that that will help bring the pipeline and make it real to the investors who are looking for opportunities in the space.
Thank you, Tony. So we have time for another round of questions very quickly. And I want you guys to be a little bit shorter. And let's talk about, I think inspired by Natalie, let's talk about like actions and attitudes of what we can do different tomorrow and especially until 2025. So I want each of you to kind of like finish my phrase. So if you want to be leaders in this transition to a net zero world, Brazilian needs to do more of, ... less of, ... So Luciana, taking a look at the financial sector, like in few words, what shall Brazilian banks do more, Brazilian banks and other actors do more and do less in terms of attitudes going back to Brazil?
I think it's not about doing more or less. I agree with Marina that we need to be very efficient in terms of capital allocation. We don't have the same fiscal power as Europe, the US, and this is a threat for Brazil. Those countries are launching huge packs of incentives and subsidies that Brazil cannot do, but we need to be very sharp and very focused in allocating our capital. I think because the biggest threat of Brazil is cost of capital. So if we are able to be smart enough to allocate the capital in the right projects, then I think we have a chance.
Thank you. Tony, talking, so several of investors that come to Brazil, especially foreign investors, they come to look in NBS or other sectors and say, okay, you don't have enough good projects, and you've found several of them. So what do you think project owners that are looking for financial resources should do more, should do better, and should stop doing to get a better financial flow?
I think the project development community is bifurcated right now. You've got project developers that have incredibly strong backing from strategics, and you have another group of project developers that are much smaller and don't have the same level of resources. So I think, simplistically, what we need to do is encourage that second tier of developers and provide them with the kinds of coaching and mentorship that they can get ready to actually talk to capital markets, because right now they're not quite there. But overall, I think that we've seen just over the last 48 months a really strong rush of talent into the space, and also a number of really elite management teams forming. So I think it's really a question of just leveling them up.
What they have to stop doing?
I think that that's a hard question, right? But I think that unless the carbon markets become really clear really quickly, we need to also have business models within the project development community that are not entirely anchored on carbon. One of those opportunities, which I think is probably the largest single opportunity for attracting international capital into Brazil, is restoration of degraded pasture land. And we're starting to see project developers and funds focus on that. It looks like it has a really, really strong return. It's a real assets play. In order to make it work better, we need to make it easier for foreign capital to participate at the land level in the real assets business in Brazil.
Thank you. Marina, in terms of practices, so your daily life is to deal with CEOs and directors of the largest Brazilian companies. What do you think that company leaders should do more and should stop doing, should do differently going forward to push the net zero agenda in Brazil?
Well, I think we have to accelerate what we are already doing. I think collaboration is a key thing for that. We have a council of CEOs. I think that in this council that has maybe 7 years, we create a new culture there, and they support each other because there are risks in this journey. And I think, part is to have a confident environment so that you can really face the risks that you have ahead. So I think collaboration is a key thing between them, and also collaboration with the government. As we by CEBDS, we are a platform for talking with NGOs, talking with federal government and municipalities and so on. I think we're having a new momentum. Transparency, of course, that's a key thing also. But also, one thing that's really important is that within the company, they really talk the same language. So a sustainability area has to talk the same language as the people that are making lobby in the Congress. They have to tell the same language. I think that will be a huge advance if we do this more. We have to translate inside the company the risk area of what is happening on sustainability. So I think this breaking those walls inside the same company will be really important. Traceability for Brazil is also a very important thing. I think if the government supports, we can accelerate this a lot. If we became a country that we are all doing that, it's much more, it's a huge advantage for Brazil. And maybe working also inside the companies to understand and to influence, and we are trying to do this with Minister Haddad, the bills, the taxations, because we have to interfere and sometimes accept, because we have a role to play on this. Companies have a role to play on this, and so I think this kind of understanding they are changing. I think we are really in a special moment, and I agree with Natalie that having a COP30 in the Amazon area will be a very important symbol about what Brazil can offer. And of course, we have to tackle inequality inside the companies, because companies, it's really inside the companies we have a very different incomes from the bottom to the up. I think there is also working on this. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Natalie, you got the funniest part, right? So talking about politicians. What should Brazilian policymakers and politicians do more? What should they do less? And let's restrain to climate, right? Otherwise, we don't have enough time. But please talk about federal government. Like we typically look at the federal government. Also important to touch on Congress. Congressmen have a huge role to play. Luciana was talking about several bills, right? So the federal government doesn't write bills, doesn't approve bills. We need the Congress. And also about the role of state and local governments.
Very easy. I have 2 minutes to kind of touch on that. No, I have actually a long list of a wish list here, and I could cite, but I don't think it's the better use of my time. I think we gotta have more decisive action in Congress that is pro-climate, and the Congress has a concrete opportunity now with the cap and trade system. It's in their hands. We haven't seen much tension in Congress. Of course, there are different bills, there are divergences, but overall, it's something that is unifying various fronts, various caucuses. So I think that's going to be a good test for our Congress in terms of, for the first time, adopting a market-based instrument for the climate policy. So this is one thing. So I want to see more of that resolve, more of that collaboration in that sense. Of course, we need the Congress to be less less favorable to amnesty to the foresters, because from time to time, actually, I have a friend, Brenda, who tracks that. She told me once that every 3 to 4 years, new bills related to land tenure, they appear in the Congress, and then they try to change the rules for land use in the region. So, of course, we have to stop that. Please, Congress, stop. We cannot afford having that kind of incentives coming on and on from time to time. But there are many issues that can be done at the executive power, for sure, and I think that's those are lower-hanging fruits. We need a transparent, credible, and ambitious new NDC, for instance. I hope before COP28, well, COP30 at last, a net zero implementation strategy. We need a functional governance, including the states and also civil society. We don't have that for climate at the moment. And finally, I want to finalize with something which is critical if we want to get to 2030 with the end of deforestation, which is to make sure that we have a policy to create conservation jobs. I'm not talking here about payment for ecosystem services nor carbon markets, but really establishing something that this country did when Roosevelt was the president, which was the Conservation Corps. They started paying for people who were conserving, who were restoring, and I think that's the kind of public policy that would go along with Brazil's traditions and so on. So more conservation jobs, more investments, and less stupid political decisions. Thank you.
We couldn't have a better ending. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.